It all started on a quiet Tuesday evening. I was in my room playing video games like any other teenager my age. My mom was downstairs cleaning up after dinner. The house felt still, almost too still, as if something was hiding in the silence. I didn't think much of it at first, but I kept hearing these whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe the old house settling down, but the whispers started to sound like my mom's voice. She wasn't talking to me, though. The whispers were too low to make out clearly, but I could swear I heard her say my name. Curious, I paused my game and tiptoed to the top of the stairs. I peeked down and saw her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at an old photograph of my grandmother who had passed away a few years ago. There was something different about her. Her face looked distant, her eyes heavy with worry, as if she was lost in thought. I called out to her, "Mom, everything okay?" She didn't respond. It was like she didn't hear me at all. My heart began to pound a little harder. Something felt off, but I couldn't place it. Eventually, I shrugged it off and went back to my room, thinking maybe she just needed a moment alone. The next day, the atmosphere at home remained heavy. Mom didn't say much throughout the day, but I noticed she was more distracted than usual. Later that evening, she asked me something that made my heart skip a beat. "I need you to come with me tonight," she said suddenly while we were sitting in the living room. "Where?" I asked, my eyebrows furrowing. "To the cemetery," she replied, her voice low and almost mechanical, like she had rehearsed the words 100 times in her head. I felt a chill run down my spine. The cemetery? At night? Why would anyone want to go there, especially my mom? "Why?" I asked, my voice trembling a bit. She looked at me with those same distant eyes, the ones I'd seen the night before. "There's something I need to do, and you need to come with me. Don't ask too many questions, okay? Just trust me." The request was so out of character for her. My mom had never been the superstitious type, and she definitely wasn't the kind of person to visit cemeteries at night. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to refuse, but there was something about the way she looked at me, like she really needed me, that made me agree. That night, around 11 p.m., Mom and I got into the car. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the quiet streets as we drove through town. The further we went, the darker it became. Streetlights began to disappear, replaced by the towering shadows of trees that lined the road leading to the cemetery. I sat there, staring out the window, my stomach in knots. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something bad was going to happen. Mom didn't say a word the entire drive. Her eyes were locked on the road ahead, her grip on the steering wheel tight. "Mom, are you sure we have to do this?" I finally asked, breaking the tense silence. She glanced at me for a second, her expression unreadable. "Yes, it's important." That was all she said. I swallowed hard and nodded, though I still didn't understand why we were doing this. I felt like I was walking into a nightmare, one I couldn't wake up from. We arrived at the cemetery just past midnight. The old iron gate creaked as Mom pushed it open, and the sound echoed through the night like a warning. I hesitated before following her inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The cemetery was huge, with rows and rows of tombstones stretching into the darkness. A cold wind blew through the trees, rustling the leaves, making everything seem even more sinister. I stayed close to my mom as we walked deeper into the graveyard. The further we went, the darker it got. The moonlight barely reached us through the thick canopy of trees. Every step I took felt heavier, like something was pulling me back, urging me to turn around and run. But I didn't. Finally, Mom stopped in front of an old, crumbling tombstone. It was covered in moss and looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. She knelt down and placed her hand on it, closing her eyes as if she was trying to feel something. "What are we doing here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer me. Instead, she started whispering something under her breath. The words were too soft for me to hear, but they sounded almost like a prayer or a chant. Suddenly, the air around us grew colder, and I could feel goosebumps rise on my arms. I glanced around nervously, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. just the silent, oppressive darkness. After what felt like an eternity, Mom finally stood up and turned to face me. Her expression was calm, but there was something in her eyes that made my blood run cold. "It's time," she said, her voice barely audible. "Time for what?" I asked, my heart racing. She pointed to the tombstone. "We need to open it." I blinked, not sure I heard her right. "Open it? You mean dig it up?" She nodded, her face completely serious. My mind raced. This was crazy. We couldn't just dig up a grave in the middle of the night. What was she even thinking? I can't do that," I stammered, shaking my head. "Mom, this is wrong." She stepped closer to me, her eyes pleading. "Please, trust me, I need your help. This is the only way." Her voice cracked, and I could see tears welling up in her eyes. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew she was desperate. For whatever reason, this was important to her, and despite my fear, I couldn't just walk away. With a deep breath, I nodded. "Okay, what do we do?" We found some old shovels nearby, ones that looked like they hadn't been used in years, and began digging. The dirt was hard and cold, and with every shovelful, I felt like I was sinking deeper into some kind of twisted nightmare. It took hours, but finally we reached something solid. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Mom motioned for me to stop, and together we uncovered an old wooden coffin. It was small, too small for an adult. My stomach churned at the sight of it. Who is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mom knelt down beside the coffin, her fingers trembling as she brushed dirt off the top. She didn't answer me at first, but I could see the pain in her eyes. It's your brother," she whispered, her voice barely audible. My world spun. My brother? I didn't have a brother, at least not one I knew of. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I don't have a brother." She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "You did. You just don't remember." I felt the blood drain from my face. I stared at the small coffin, my mind unable to process what my mom had just said. A brother? How could I have a brother and not remember him? My whole life I had been an only child. There had never been any mention of a sibling, not even a hint. And yet, here we were, standing over his grave. I shook my head, backing away from the coffin. No, this can't be true. I would have remembered. I don't have a brother." Mom wiped the tears from her face, her hands trembling as she closed the distance between us. "You were too young when it happened. We never talked about it because I thought it was for the best. But now I realize how wrong I was." I could barely breathe. My chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing the air out of my lungs. "What happened to him?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mom turned her gaze to the small coffin. Her eyes were full of sorrow, but there was something else there too, guilt. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said quietly. "We never meant to keep it from you for so long, but he died when he was very young, and when we buried him I thought I could just move on. But I couldn't." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. All these years I had lived my life without knowing that I had a brother who had died, a brother whose grave we were now standing over in the middle of the night. I felt numb, the weight of the situation crashing down on me like a tidal wave. I didn't know what to say, what to feel, or even how to react. My legs felt weak, and I had to steady myself on a nearby tombstone to keep from falling over. "How did he die?" I asked, my voice barely audible. It was the only question I could think to ask. Mom looked away, her eyes filled with a deep sadness that I had never seen before. "It was an accident. He was only 4 years old at the time. We were outside and he wandered off. We didn't realize he had fallen into the pond until it was too late." Her words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and I felt a lump form in my throat. I couldn't even imagine the pain she must have gone through, losing a child in such a tragic way. No wonder she had buried the memory deep inside. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I should have told you sooner, but I didn't know how. It was easier to pretend it never happened, but I've carried the guilt with me every day. Tears filled my eyes, and I didn't even try to stop them. The weight of the truth was too much. I had lost a brother, and I never even knew he existed. As we stood there, the silence of the cemetery pressed in around us, thick and suffocating. The wind had picked up, and it howled through the trees like a ghostly whisper. But even in the darkness, I could sense there was more to the story. My mom hadn't brought me here just to tell me about my brother. There was something else, something she wasn't saying. "Why are we here now?" I asked, wiping the tears from my face. "After all this time, why bring me to his grave tonight?" Mom hesitated for a moment before answering. "Because there's something you need to understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your brother, he's not resting in peace." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what she meant, but her words filled me with a deep sense of dread. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. She knelt down beside the small coffin, her fingers brushing the dirt that still clung to the wooden surface. "Ever since he died, I've felt him, his presence. It's like he's still here, trapped somehow. And I think he needs our help." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was she suggesting that my brother's spirit was still here, lingering in the cemetery? The thought sent a shiver through my entire body. "You don't really believe that, do you?" I asked, my voice shaking. Mom didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with a desperate kind of hope. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she admitted. "But I know I've felt him. I've heard him. And I think tonight is the night we can finally set him free." My legs felt like they were made of lead as I watched my mom pull something out of her bag. It was a small, worn-out book with yellowed pages and strange symbols on the cover. I had never seen it before, but just looking at it made me uneasy. "What is that?" I asked, my voice filled with fear. "It's something that was passed down in our family," she explained, flipping through the pages. "It's an old ritual, one that's supposed to help spirits move on." I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. Was she really planning to perform some kind of ritual right here in the middle of the cemetery? It all felt so surreal, like I had stepped into a nightmare and couldn't wake up. "Mom, this is crazy," I said, my voice shaking. "We shouldn't be doing this." She looked at me, her expression serious. "I know it sounds crazy, but we have to try. If there's even a chance we can help your brother, don't you think we should take it?" I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to run away, to leave the cemetery and pretend none of this was happening. But another part of me, the part that had always trusted my mom, wanted to believe her. Maybe there was something to this. Maybe, just maybe, we really could help my brother find peace. With trembling hands, I nodded. "Okay," I said softly. "What do we have to do?" Mom didn't waste any time. She knelt down beside the small grave, opened the book to a specific page, and began to read aloud. The words were in a language I didn't understand, an ancient tongue that sent shivers down my spine with every syllable. It felt wrong, like we were tampering with something we shouldn't be. As she chanted, the air around us seemed to grow colder. The wind picked up, swirling through the cemetery with a force that made the trees creak and groan. I glanced around, feeling like we were being watched. The shadows seemed to shift and move, almost like they were alive. "Mom, I don't like this," I said, my voice shaking. She didn't stop chanting. Her eyes were closed, her voice steady as she recited the words from the book. I could see her breath in the cold night air, and it came out in short, sharp puffs. Suddenly, the ground beneath us began to tremble. It was subtle at first, like a low rumble, but it quickly grew stronger. The tombstones around us shook, and I could hear the sound of dirt shifting beneath our feet. "Mom, what's happening?" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. She didn't answer. Her chanting grew louder, more urgent, and the wind howled even louder in response. It was like the whole cemetery was coming alive around us. Just as I thought the ground would split open beneath us, everything stopped. The wind died down, the rumbling ceased, and the cemetery fell into an eerie silence. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart in my ears. For a moment I thought it was over, that whatever we had done had worked. But then I felt it. A presence, cold and heavy, like someone was standing right behind me. My skin prickled with fear and I turned slowly, half expecting to see something terrifying. But there was nothing there, just the empty darkness of the cemetery. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She stood up slowly, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "He's here," she said quietly. "I can feel him." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do we do now?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out as if trying to feel something in the air. Her eyes darted around the cemetery, searching for something I couldn't see. "He's waiting," she whispered. "We have to finish the ritual." Mom opened the book again, her hands shaking as she flipped through the pages. She found the final part of the ritual and began to read, her voice soft but steady. I stood there, frozen in place, my heart racing as the air around us seemed to grow colder with every word she spoke. Suddenly I heard it, a voice, soft and distant, like it was coming from far away. "Mom!" I froze. The voice was faint, barely more than a whisper, but I knew I had heard it. And it wasn't my mom speaking. It was a child's voice, a boy's voice. I turned to my mom, my eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" She nodded, her face pale. "It's him," she whispered. "He's here." The voice came again, this time louder. "Mom, why did you leave me?" My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. The voice was full of pain, and it sent chills down my spine. "Please," it said, "don't leave me again." Tears filled my mom's eyes as she continued chanting, but I could see the guilt weighing heavily on her. The voice was growing louder, more desperate, and I could feel the tension in the air. It was like we were walking a tightrope, and one wrong move could send us spiraling into something we couldn't control. "Mom, we have to stop," I said, panic rising in my voice. "This isn't right. We shouldn't be doing this." She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to leave him behind. I thought I was protecting you." Her words broke my heart. I stood frozen, trying to process what my mom had just confessed. She had been trying to protect me by burying the past, but now that past had risen up, demanding answers. The voice of my brother, haunting, desperate, echoed in the air between us. "Why did you leave me?" the voice asked again, more insistent this time. I could almost feel the sadness and anger woven into those words. I took a step back, my legs trembling. "Mom, what do we do?" Mom was silent for a moment, her head hanging low as if the weight of her guilt was crushing her. Finally, she looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "We have to finish what we started. We have to help him. We have to set him free." "How?" I asked, my voice shaking. "How do we set him free?" She pointed to the book she was holding. "There's a final passage, an incantation. It's supposed to send him to the other side, to give him peace." My heart pounded in my chest as I watched her turn the page. The air around us felt thick, like it was pressing in from all sides. My mind raced with questions. What if this didn't work? What if we made things worse? But before I could say anything, Mom started to chant again, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. As Mom chanted the final words of the ritual, the temperature around us dropped even further. I could see my breath puffing out in front of me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It felt like something was closing in, surrounding us. Then suddenly the voice returned, clearer than ever. "Don't leave me!" I whipped around, my eyes scanning the cemetery. But again there was nothing there, just the graves, the cold wind, and the dark sky. But I knew he was there. My brother. I felt a strange pull in my chest, an overwhelming sense of sorrow. He wasn't angry, he was scared, lost. He had been alone in this cemetery for so long, and now he was afraid we were going to abandon him again. "I'm here!" I shouted, not knowing what else to do. "I'm here, I'm not leaving you!" For a moment the air grew still, as if the world was holding its breath. And then the voice returned, softer this time, almost pleading. "Help me!" Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized how much pain my brother must have been in, stuck in this place, unable to move on. I couldn't imagine what it must have been like for him, feeling abandoned by the very people who were supposed to protect him. Mom's chanting grew louder, and I could feel the tension in the air shift. It was like something was about to give, like we were on the verge of breaking through to the other side. I stepped closer to the small grave, my heart pounding in my chest. "We didn't mean to leave you," I whispered, hoping somehow my words would reach him. "We didn't know, but we're here now. We're here to help." Mom finished the last words of the incantation, her voice trembling. For a moment, everything was still. The wind stopped, the trees stood silent, and the cemetery felt frozen in time. And then, just as I thought nothing had happened, I felt it. A warmth, gentle and soft, like the touch of a hand on my shoulder. "He's here," Mom whispered, her voice filled with awe. I looked up at her, my heart racing. "Is it over? Did it work?" She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. I think we did it. I think he's at peace." The warmth I had felt moments ago slowly faded, and with it, the heavy weight that had been pressing down on my chest. The air around us seemed lighter now, less oppressive. It was as if the entire cemetery had exhaled a sigh of relief. I didn't hear my brother's voice again, but I knew he was no longer trapped here. I could feel it in my bones. The ritual had worked, and he had finally moved on. Mom knelt beside the small grave, her hands resting on the earth. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for everything." I stood beside her, unsure of what to say. There were no words that could make up for what had happened. But I hoped that somehow my brother knew that we had never meant to leave him behind, that we had loved him, even if we hadn't been able to show it the way we should have. As the silence stretched on, I felt a sense of closure settle over me. For the first time, I truly understood what we had come here to do. We hadn't just come to confront the past, we had come to make peace with it. After a long moment of silence, Mom stood up, wiping the dirt from her hands. Her face was streaked with tears, and she looked like she had aged 10 years in the span of a few hours. The weight of her guilt had lifted, but the scars it had left behind were still visible. "I should have told you sooner," she said softly, her voice filled with regret. "I should have let you know the truth." I shook my head. "It's not your fault. You did what you thought was best, and now we've made things right." She smiled weakly, though her eyes were still filled with sorrow. I wish I could have been a better mother to him. He deserved more." I didn't know how to respond to that. There was no way to undo the past, no way to change what had happened. But at least now, we had given my brother the peace he deserved. "Come on," I said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Let's go home." We turned to leave the cemetery, the night air still cold but less biting than before. The walk back to the car felt much longer than it had earlier, as if the weight of what we had just done had made everything feel heavier. As we passed the rows of tombstones, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder one last time. The cemetery was silent, the shadows no longer shifting in the wind. And for the first time all night, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. My brother was gone, but he wasn't alone anymore. He was finally at peace. When we reached the car, Mom paused, looking back at the cemetery with a wistful expression. "Do you think he forgave me?" she asked quietly. I didn't have the answer to that question, but I knew one thing for sure. "I think he knows you loved him, and that's what matters." She nodded, though I could see the tears in her eyes again. We climbed into the car, and as we drove away from the cemetery, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a deep sense of closure. The drive home was quiet. Neither of us said much, and I could tell Mom was lost in her thoughts. The events of the night had been intense, and we both needed time to process everything that had happened. As we pulled into our driveway, the familiar sight of our house brought a sense of comfort. It was strange. Just a few hours ago, I had been living my normal life, unaware of the secrets that had been buried in my family's past. And now, everything felt different. I had a brother I had never known, a brother who had been lost too soon. Mom parked the car and turned off the engine, sitting in silence for a moment before turning to me. "Thank you for coming with me tonight," she said softly. "I couldn't have done it without you." I nodded, though I still wasn't sure how I felt about everything. "I'm just glad we could help him." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Me too." The next few days were strange. Life went on as usual, but there was an unspoken understanding between Mom and me. Something had shifted, and things would never be quite the same again. We didn't talk much about that night at the cemetery, but I knew it weighed heavily on her. I could see it in the way she moved, the way her eyes seemed distant at times. But at least now, the secret she had been carrying for so long was out in the open, and while it was painful, it was also freeing. As for me, I couldn't stop thinking about my brother. I wondered what he had been like, what kind of person he would have grown up to be. I wished I had known him, wished I could have had the chance to be his brother, but I knew that wasn't possible. All I could do now was hold on to the memory of that night, the night we had finally helped him find peace. One evening, about a week after our visit to the cemetery, something strange happened. I was sitting in my room scrolling through my phone when I heard a faint knock on my door. "Come in," I called out, expecting it to be Mom. But when the door creaked open, no one was there. I frowned, getting up from my bed to check the hallway. It was empty. I shook my head, chalking it up to my imagination. But as I turned to go back into my room, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Written on the foggy surface of my window, in letters that looked like they had been traced by a finger, was a single word. "Thanks." I stared at the word, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one else in the house, no one who could have written that message. And then, just as suddenly as the word had appeared, the fog on the window cleared and the message was gone. But I knew what I had seen, and in that moment I felt a warmth spread through me, a feeling of peace, of closure. My brother was gone, but he wasn't lost anymore. He had found his way, and now he was saying goodbye. That message on the window was the last sign I ever received from my brother. After that night, everything seemed to return to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after everything we had been through. Mom and I never talked about the message, but I think she knew. There was a quiet understanding between us, a shared sense of peace. We had done what we needed to do, and now it was time to move on. As the weeks passed, life slowly returned to its usual rhythm. School, work, the everyday routines that had once seemed so important now felt trivial in comparison to what we had experienced. But I knew that night at the cemetery had changed me forever. It had shown me the power of the past, the weight of secrets, and the importance of letting go. And though I would never forget my brother, I knew he was finally at peace. As time went on, the memories of that night became less vivid, but they never fully faded. I would still think about my brother from time to time, wondering what his life could have been like if things had been different. But those thoughts didn't bring me sadness anymore. Instead, they brought me a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of the past. Mom seemed to find her own way of coping too. She still visited the cemetery occasionally, but it was different now. She didn't go there out of guilt or regret. She went there to honor his memory, to leave flowers by his grave, and to remember the good times, however brief they had been. Life had a way of moving forward, even after the darkest moments, and though the past would always be a part of me, I had learned to live with it, to carry it with me without letting it weigh me down. Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized that the real lesson wasn't about ghosts or the supernatural. It was about family, about love, and about the lengths we would go to for the people we care about. My mom had kept a secret for years, believing she was protecting me. And in the end, we both had to face that secret together. We had to confront the pain and the guilt, but we also found healing and forgiveness. I had followed my mom to a cemetery that night, expecting to find fear and darkness. But what I found instead was a deeper understanding of my family, of the love that had always been there. even in the midst of tragedy. And though I had lost a brother I never knew, I had gained something even more valuable, a sense of closure, of peace, and of hope for the future.